My childhood sweetheart was framed for murder by the Whitmore family because we were poor, because we were young, and because they needed someone expendable. They called him a killer, silenced me with threats, and thought our story would rot in a forgotten file from 1997. But they were wrong. I built an empire from silence, from guilt, from every sleepless night they gave me. And now, I have everything they once used to destroy us: power, proof, and a plan. This isn't a tale of forgiveness. It's the reckoning they never saw coming. They put Caleb in handcuffs the same night I told him I'd wait for him forever. I was 15. He was 17. And we were kids who thought love could outlive anything, even fear. That night, we snuck out after curfew to meet behind the little corner store with the rusted soda fridge and the flickering neon sign. We were supposed to sit on crates, talk about the stars, maybe share a kiss. Instead, we stumbled into something no child should ever see. The store door was cracked open, the bell didn't chime. Inside, a man lay sprawled behind the counter, a bottle of cola shattered near his head, red pooling faster than we could comprehend. Caleb pulled me back, shielding my eyes, but it was too late. We had seen everything. Or at least enough. I remember the way the blood glistened under the refrigerator light. I remember the silence between us as we backed away. I remember the sirens. We were the first ones there. But a few hours later, the cops weren't knocking on my door. They were dragging Caleb away from his face still stained with the fear he hadn't had time to shake. I ran behind the police car, barefoot, screaming his name. But no one turned around. The Whitmores owned everything in our town, the land, the schools, the mayor's loyalty. And they owned the story. The victim was one of theirs. So was the gun, though they never mentioned that part. All they needed was a suspect, a quiet boy, a nobody. Someone without a father, someone who couldn't afford a lawyer. Caleb fit their narrative like a lamb fits the altar. The news anchor read the headline like it was nothing. Local teen arrested in fatal robbery. No mention of witnesses, no mention of fear. Just a polished lie wrapped in a 3-minute segment before the weather report. I sat in the back of the courtroom, silent. I saw him glance at me just once as they read the verdict. His eyes didn't beg, they mourned. Not just for himself, but for the truth I couldn't bring myself to say. I wanted to speak. I really did. But my voice collapsed under the weight of their power. They threatened to ruin my family. They told me I didn't see what I thought I saw. They made me believe I'd be next. So he went to prison, and I went into silence. But I wasn't finished. I just didn't know this was only the beginning. If you were 15, watching the person you loved get taken away while you're forced into silence, would you have found the courage to speak? I didn't. But what happened next proved that silence doesn't mean surrender. Caleb was sentenced to 30 years in prison. I wasn't allowed to say goodbye. They didn't let me see him, didn't let me write. The moment the verdict dropped like a guillotine, my life was packed into a single duffel bag, and I was shipped off across state lines to live with an aunt I barely knew. I wasn't even allowed to take my journal, the one he gave me on my 13th birthday, the one with our initials scribbled on the first page. Just me, my silence, and memories that refused to leave. I tried to adjust, tried to blend into a new school, new house, new rules. But there's no instruction manual for how to breathe when the one person who ever made you feel whole is caged for something you know he didn't do. Caleb's face haunted the back of my eyelids. I kept seeing the look he gave me that night, the quiet understanding that I couldn't save him, and the promise that he wouldn't blame me for it. Years passed like shadows. I followed every parole hearing, read every article. His name would show up in the smallest font, buried under real estate scandals and high school football scores. Denied. That word became the only update the world seemed to care about. 3 times they rejected his request for clemency. 3 times they deemed him too dangerous, too unrepentant, too tied to a lie we both knew wasn't his. He never wrote me, he never called, but I understood. Silence became his shield, and guilt became mine. I kept waiting for someone to step forward, to confess, to do what I didn't have the strength to do, but no one ever did. Because the truth is, no one powerful ever has to. Not when your last name is Whitmore, not when you have entire systems wrapped around your crooked fingers. I did everything I could to live a normal life. I got good grades, went to college, smiled at the right moments, built something out of the nothing they left me with, but it always felt like I was constructing success on top of a sinkhole. Because how can you feel free when the person you love is still behind bars for a crime you watched someone else commit? They didn't put me in a cell, but I was never really free. You might think that's where the story ends. But what if I told you, those years in the shadows were just the beginning of a plan decades in the making? Stick with me, because the game is about to change. 28 years had passed. I had built an empire from algorithms and fire. An empire that scanned every corner of the digital world and made sense of chaos. I was the CEO of one of the world's most advanced tech firms, a leader in AI, data forensics, and digital resurrection. I had the money. I had the talent. I had the power to reconstruct entire histories from fragments of code. But I didn't have him. I had never had him back. Then came the day everything tilted. My engineers were running tests on a new AI framework, something meant to scan misfiled criminal records and resurrect them with context. It was a quiet afternoon. No one expected anything earth-shattering. But when the screen flashed, a corrupted video file marked, archived June 1997, no probable value, something in me froze. I opened the footage. It was grainy, overexposed, warped by time, a gas station security cam barely functioning. And yet, there he was, a figure stepping out of the store where it all began, and on his hand, unmistakable even in that blur, was a signet ring. An heirloom I had seen only once, but remembered forever. The Whitmore crest. I didn't speak. I didn't blink. I scrubbed back, froze the frame, enhanced. My hands shook, but my eyes were stone. I hadn't been wrong. I had just been powerless. But now, I wasn't that 15-year-old girl anymore, whispering apologies into her pillow, hoping her silence wouldn't choke her. I was Evelyn Cross, and I had everything I needed. That night, I didn't go home. I sealed the doors to my office and summoned only those I trusted with everything. A forensic AI architect, a civil rights attorney, a retired federal investigator who owed me one. I gave them a single sentence. I'm rewriting 1997. We mapped out a timeline. We pulled every file, every video feed, every digital footprint the Whitmores had tried to erase. I watched in silence as my team resurrected the past with surgical precision. Not out of revenge, no. This was deeper. This was a reclamation. Because I wasn't confused, I wasn't delusional, and I damn sure wasn't dead. I was just getting started. Now, imagine having all the tools to rewrite the past. Would you dare open the door you once ran from? I did. And the first domino was about to fall. I didn't storm the courthouse. I didn't make a speech or throw accusations in a headline. I let the data speak first. The first move was subtle, surgical. I reached out to a nonprofit legal foundation known for dismantling wrongful convictions. I never gave them my name, just a nondescript flash drive delivered to their encrypted Dropbox, stamped with nothing but the date that had been carved into my memory like a scar. June 13th, 1997. Inside that file was everything they needed to crack open a sealed coffin of lies. The recovered surveillance footage. A ledger of wire transfers traced to the retired sheriff's private account, each one dated suspiciously close to the trial. And a series of high-resolution, unaltered photographs of the original crime scene, time-stamped and raw, before the filters of corruption had whitewashed them. At the same time, I sent a plain envelope to Caleb's pro bono attorney. Inside was a post-it note, handwritten, anonymous. Refile for DNA testing. North wall, inside paneling. Alongside it, a cleanly formatted lab report, generated by our own system, matching the blood sample stored under the wrong case code for over 2 decades. Misfiled, forgotten, until now. Within 10 days, the ripples began. A blogger on the East Coast broke the story of a potential whistleblower leak involving cold evidence and a powerful political dynasty. Then came a local paper, bolder, more direct, tying the resurfaced footage to the original case that put Caleb behind bars. That's when it happened. A leaked internal email from the Whitmore estate. 4 chilling words. Purge all archive backups. They didn't even try to hide it. They were cleaning house and panicking. The first domino had fallen, and I didn't stop to watch it hit the floor. I didn't need the court's permission. I didn't knock on the system's door. I pried it off its hinges and walked through. Quiet, precise, intentional. I didn't want revenge. I wanted reckoning. No, I wasn't going to war. I was rewriting the terms of surrender. And if they thought this was just a flare in the dark, they hadn't seen the storm. You think exposing the truth would be enough, right? But what comes next is bigger. The courtroom, the collapse, the moment the liars finally run out of lies. Ready to see what justice really looks like? The courtroom was packed. Not with supporters, not with spectators, but with silence. That kind of silence that hums before a thunderclap, where even the air feels like it's holding its breath. Caleb stood in his prison-issue blazer, slightly too big, the sleeves hanging awkwardly at his wrists. His hair, once chestnut, had turned a dignified silver, and his back, once proud and tall, was now slightly bent. But his eyes hadn't changed. When they met mine across the room, I didn't see the prison. I saw the boy who used to hold my hand in the summer rain and whisper promises into the dark. The parole board was stiff, unreadable. Then Marissa stood, calm, measured, and devastating. She laid out the digital dossier like it was a eulogy, not for Caleb, but for the lie that had buried him alive. Every line of data, every timestamp, every manipulated file came together like a symphony of truth. The recovered footage, the DNA report, the bribe trail. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The prosecutor tried to object. The board overruled him. Then came the moment that snapped the room in half. The subpoena. The retired sheriff was called to testify. Face like wet ash, hands trembling, jaw clenched so tight it looked locked. He didn't speak. He just stared down at the floor as the parole board turned to the courtroom and uttered the words I'd waited 28 years to hear. We move for immediate dismissal of the original conviction. Mr. Rivers is free to go. Caleb didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He just exhaled. One long, silent breath that seemed to carry decades of chains with it. And as the room stirred, phones buzzed like a storm breaking across the state. The headlines struck first on the local feed, then exploded nationally. Senator Douglas Whitmore under federal investigation in cold case tampering. Live cameras caught his arrival at a luncheon. His face stunned as an aide whispered in his ear, the blood draining from his cheeks. He turned to the cameras, opened his mouth, and froze. He went silent. He was freed, but freedom isn't the end. It's the beginning of reckoning. What would you do if you could buy the house of the family that tried to erase your truth? Let me show you what I did. I didn't send a letter. I didn't hold a press conference. I bought the house. The Whitmore estate, perched high on Maple Hill, surrounded by wrought iron gates and whispers of power, had sat empty for months. After the federal investigation broke, no one in that family wanted to touch it. It was toxic real estate now, a monument to a dynasty built on lies. But to me, it was something else entirely. It was the place where they toasted to their own impunity while Caleb was dragged away in cuffs. It was the place where they buried the truth beneath polished marble and designer silence. So I bought it. I didn't change the architecture. I didn't gut the interiors or erase the family crest from the stained glass windows. I let it all remain, like a ghost caught in its own reflection. The only thing I added was a small plaque on the front gate. Polished bronze. Minimalist font. Freeman House, a place for the wrongly accused. And then I opened the doors. The mayor came, of course, too embarrassed not to. So did the district attorney and half the people who once called me the quiet little cross girl who should know her place. But that afternoon, they stood in folding chairs on the former Whitmore lawn, squinting up at me as I stepped behind the microphone. I didn't wear designer, just a plain black blazer and flats. My presence was a statement. I looked over the crowd, the valley, the rooftops I once viewed from below. Then I said, I didn't buy this house for revenge. I bought it because I like the view from this side. I let the silence sit. Let them taste it. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even triumph. It was something colder, something cleaner. It was power, earned, and displayed like a painting, unframed, unhidden, unforgettable. Now here's where it gets personal. Justice might fix the past, but healing, that takes something deeper. Want to know what happens when two broken people learn to breathe again? I didn't know how to love a man who had spent more years behind bars than free, who had missed everything from cell phones to the scent of basil on a hot summer breeze. But I knew where to start, with silence and with listening. The first few mornings after Caleb was released, we didn't speak much. Words felt too clumsy, too small for the weight of what we carried. So we sat instead, under the pink-blossomed dogwood trees that lined the back garden of Freeman House, each of us cradling mugs of ginger tea, letting the warmth anchor us. The breeze would catch the edge of his letters. Those 28 years of unsent words he kept folded in a box worn thin at the corners. I read them slowly, one by one, like sacred scripture. Some were angry, some were broken, some were so tender they made my throat ache. All of them were true. We didn't talk about the prison walls, not at first. We talked about the plum tree we used to steal fruit from as kids. We talked about my mother's burnt cornbread, about the rusted swing set that still stood in the schoolyard, its chains squealing in the wind. We talked about everything that had once made us feel human. I began planting again. Nothing extravagant, just simple things. Lavender, rosemary, a few rose bushes along the fence. Caleb took to fixing up the kitchen, the one that still carried scars of old piping and worn floorboards. We didn't hire help. We worked with our hands, side by side, sanding cabinets, scrubbing grout, laying tile as if reassembling something more than a room. It became a space for cooking classes, offered quietly, freely, to young men who had once been where Caleb was. He taught them how to make bread from scratch. I taught them how to season hope. We called it rebuilding, but really, it was remembering. Remembering what it means to be useful, to be safe, to be seen. I started sleeping again. Real sleep. Not the kind broken by nightmares of cold metal cuffs or courtroom whispers, but the kind that lulls you into dreaming about lemon pies and soft jazz on a Sunday. I no longer woke gasping. I no longer rehearsed the trial in my head. There were still shadows, of course. But now, when they came, I let them pass through me instead of clinging to them like armor. The neighbors began stopping by, not out of curiosity, but out of quiet solidarity. An older woman from 3 doors down brought us rhubarb from her garden. A little boy on his bike left us wildflowers in a mason jar. Even Marissa, usually so composed, came one afternoon and sat on the porch steps beside me, watching Caleb and a teenager laugh over a broken mixer. She didn't say much. She just handed me a tea towel and said, "This house feels alive again." One morning, I found Caleb in the garden, kneeling beside a patch of mint. He looked up, grinned, and said, "I think it's time we planted tomatoes." Something about the way he said it made me stop and look around, at the sun-dappled soil, at the boy who had once been ripped from my life and now stood grounded in it again. My chest tightened, not with sorrow, but with awe. Not because I had saved him, but because we had both chosen to stay. To stay in the aftermath, in the ruins, and rebuild something that didn't have to pretend to be whole. I used to think justice was the end of the road, but it wasn't. Justice was the clearing. What came after was the garden. I didn't rescue Caleb. I simply did what I should have done that night, 28 years ago, when I let fear make me silent. I stood still this time. I let the morning light rest on my shoulders. I watched him hum as he cut mint leaves for the new batch of tea, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades. I smiled, not as a survivor, but as someone finally free. You've seen how the innocent rose, but what about the guilty? Don't leave now, because the fall of the powerful sometimes happens in silence. And I promise, this silence, it's deafening. There are some ruins too silent to rebuild. The Whitmore estate, once the symbol of dominance, opulence, and generational power, now stood like a hollow monument to arrogance. The grand marble staircase, where they once posed for family portraits, was cordoned off with yellow tape. The fountains no longer ran, and the name Whitmore no longer carried weight. It carried warning. After the criminal indictments, the asset freezes, and the national humiliation, Senator Douglas Whitmore vanished from the headlines. But he didn't disappear. He simply withdrew to the only place no one would follow him. A cabin in the northern hills, barely held together by memory and moss. It had no Wi-Fi, barely any cell signal, and no trace of the legacy he'd once crafted like a sculpture of lies. The news said he was resting. A break from public life, they called it. But I knew better. It wasn't rest. It was retreat. It was exile from relevance. Rumors found their way to me, as they always do in small towns with long memories. His wife had filed for divorce, swift and uncontested. No interviews, no statements. Just a quiet separation from the name that now tainted everything it touched. The donors vanished next. Then the investment partners. The last remaining board seat he held was revoked in a single unanimous vote. His LinkedIn went dark. His official website redirected to a page not found. His social media, a ghost town. No more motivational posts about leadership or legacy. Just silence. I never saw him again in person. I didn't need to. There was no confrontation to stage, no final monologue to deliver. Vengeance, I had come to understand, didn't always arrive as a sword. It sometimes arrived as a mirror. And some men crumble simply by being made to look. Still, life has a way of staging its own reckonings. On an unplanned detour during a business trip, my bus broke down for 37 minutes outside a desolate bend in the road. Just trees, mist, and one weathered cabin tucked behind a crooked fence. There were no lights on in the front room. Just one dim, flickering bulb from the kitchen window, golden behind stained, brittle curtains, and a silhouette. He sat unmoving, his spine slightly bent, elbows on the table like a man frozen in a conversation that had ended long ago. He didn't glance at the window. He didn't move to hide. He didn't need to, because what was left to defend? The empire he'd once ruled had collapsed not in a blaze of war, but in a quiet avalanche of truth. No more cameras, no more podiums, no more operatic lies dressed as legacy, just dust, just regret, and perhaps memory. I don't know what he saw when he looked into the darkness of that kitchen night after night. Maybe he saw the smear of blood on the convenience store tiles. Maybe he heard Caleb's voice, young, scared, pleading through the plexiglass of an interrogation room. Or maybe, if the universe is merciful, he heard nothing at all, only the echo of the silence he once forced upon me. I never contacted him, never stood on his doorstep. I didn't send letters. I didn't need an apology. Because there is a kind of punishment no prison can deliver. And that is being alone with the truth when the audience is gone. That is the kind of justice I believe in now. Not theatrical, not loud, not made for headlines, but enduring. He had no more crowds to deceive, no more pawns to move, just his own breath, just his own past, just the knowledge that a teenage girl once kept her silence. And then grew up to become the very force that unraveled him. I walked away from that bus window without a word, and I never looked back. I didn't touch him. I just let him live long enough to meet the one person he spent his entire life avoiding, himself. Some stories end with revenge, but the best ones, they end with purpose. Stay with me just a little longer, because what I built out of pain is now helping others rise from theirs. A year after the storm quieted, I stood beneath a white banner that read, D97, Truth has no expiration date. I had launched Project 1997 that morning with a press release that didn't name names, didn't linger on vengeance, and didn't need to. It introduced an open-source AI platform, built by my company, yes, but now available to the world, one that allowed lawyers, journalists, families, and survivors to re-examine cold cases with the precision of machine logic and the clarity of historical data. No more forgotten archives. No more overlooked timestamps. No more families told to give up because it had been too long. I gave it the name Caleb used in every unsent letter he wrote me, D97. A quiet tribute to the year his life was stolen. And now, the year others would begin to reclaim theirs. Freeman House, once a symbol of poetic justice, became something more than symbolic. It became the heartbeat of the mission. The scent of rosemary bread still lingered in its walls, but now those walls echoed with late-night strategy calls, debriefs from small-town lawyers seeking help, and the hushed sobs of people who, for the first time in decades, had someone listening. We hosted over 300 legal volunteers from across the country, some young and idealistic, others seasoned and scarred by the system, but all of them bound by one thing: belief in truth, in restoration, in the idea that justice doesn't retire. When I was asked to speak at TEDx, I almost declined. I wasn't the kind to stand under spotlights anymore, but I remembered what Caleb said one evening as we painted the garden shed. If you don't tell them how we survived, someone else will tell them how we failed. So I walked on that stage, not as the CEO of a tech empire or the woman who toppled a dynasty, but as a witness who finally found her voice. I told them what happened in 1997. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't drag names through the mud. I simply traced the ripple of silence. How one false confession can become a lifetime sentence not just for one man, but for everyone who loved him. And then I paused. I held the clicker in my hand, staring at the image of a younger me, eyes wide, shoulders small, terrified. And I said, justice doesn't expire. And sometimes, truth just needs one person brave enough to dig it back up. The applause came gently, then rose like a tide. But I didn't feel pride. I felt release, as if I had finally exhaled the breath I'd been holding for 28 years. At the very end, as the lights dimmed and the screen faded to black, I spoke the words I had never dared to write. Not when he was arrested, not during his trial, not even on the day he was freed. But here, with the world listening and the past no longer a secret, I said, Caleb, I never stopped believing you, and I never will. That night, back at Freeman House, we sat under the porch light, a pot of lavender tea steaming between us. The garden he'd rebuilt was wild with color: purple iris, yellow daffodils, little clusters of white aster hugging the soil. He clipped a sprig of mint, handed it to me without a word. We didn't speak about the past. We didn't need to. It had spoken loud enough for too long. I placed my hand over his, the same way I had when we were 15 and the world felt too cruel for softness. And then I leaned in, close enough for only him to hear, and whispered, sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. Sometimes it's simply living better, with the one who deserved to be free. He didn't reply. He just looked at me the way he used to. Before concrete walls, before steel bars, before time tried to take him away, and smiled. There was no final battle, no closing statement in court, no slow-motion walk of triumph. Just lavender tea, and moonlight, and a woman who stopped running from the past long enough to build a future. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, even just a little, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because we've got so many more stories to tell, and I'd be honored to share them with you.